So today I want to talk to you about finding credible sources on the internet. But before we can talk about that, I want to make sure you know what the word credible means. Credible means able to be believed, convincing. You will notice also some synonyms include reasonable. And really, it's also the idea of using reliable sources, trustworthy sources, and you yourself, as the presenter of information, are you trustworthy and credible? In order to be a credible writer, presenter of information, you have to use credible, believable, trustworthy sources. The focus of this particular presentation is specifically finding information on the internet. We know there are other places to get information, books, periodicals, and throughout your education you will get information from those other types of sources for other research projects and papers, especially as you get into college level work. However, really, in our day-to-day lives, the internet is the most easily accessible. So honestly, this should help you in your education, not just for writing papers in a literature class, but for finding sources for your science fair or for finding sources for a history project. But also, it should help you find sources, find information that you can trust just anytime you're looking up information. If you're looking up something that's going on politically in the world or something that's going on in the news, you need to be able to know how to tell whether a source is a source you can trust. So this is meant to be a general presentation of how to do that. So some of these topics, as you fill in your notes, you may find that some of the things you're looking at may not be of great concern for every project, but we're going to go ahead and talk about all the ways that we need to look at a source to determine whether it's credible. Okay, the first thing you're going to be looking for is objectivity. Whether or not the author is just telling things straight, just telling facts, or whether there is any bias. Is what they're writing meant to sway your opinion? Is there evidence of bias in their word choice? Is the information slanted heavily toward a particular view? And this is probably a more relevant consideration for maybe a history class project, but we're going to go ahead and talk about it today. I want to show you an example page. Before I do that, notice that if the answer is yes to any of the above questions, the data or material might be questionable. That doesn't mean that it's something you can't use, but it's something you need to think very carefully about whether it's the best source that you can find. Okay, you'll have to bear with me on my example sources. The research paper that I have taught the most often was a research paper about current world leaders. So a lot of my sources have to do with people rather than elements of literature. But here's an example source to look at objectivity. We have our title, Bush Clears the Way for Corporate Domination, and you'll notice this is 2006, so this is so out of date. Author of the Bush Agenda explains what Bush really means when he says he wants to spread freedom around the world. When George W. Bush says he wants to spread freedom to every corner of the earth, he means it. But of course, the president that turned Soviet-era gulags into secret CIA prisons in order to do God knows what to God knows whom isn't talking about individual freedom. He means corporate freedom. Freedom for the great multinationals to extract everything they can from the world's resources and labor without the hindrance of public interest laws, environmental regulations, or worker protections. Okay, hopefully, even without the sarcastic tone of voice, you can tell that this is a biased piece. Anytime someone kind of puts words in someone's mouth, he means it, this is his agenda, that's biased. They're assuming they understand a person's point of view. God knows what to God knows whom, Soviet-era gulags. There's kind of this language here that's meant to create an emotional response in a specific way. It is slanted heavily towards a particular view. Okay, so that source is not objective, so it would be questionable if you were doing a research paper over. I have too many windows open. If you were doing a research paper over Bush and his agenda, this might not be your best source because it's not objective. Accuracy is something to consider for any source, for any reason that you are researching. And the first question here is the information accurate? And I know that seems silly. I don't know, that's why I'm researching it. But there are things you can look at to kind of get an idea. Does the information sound accurate? Sometimes you may already have an idea of what you're looking for, or some information that you've already gleaned about a topic, and so you might be able to read a source and tell right off, oh wait, that's not right. I remember that date from somewhere, that's not the right date. Or I thought this literary movement was about this, and this is saying something completely different. So as you research and read multiple sources, you may be able to pick out inaccurate information. Now, why is grammar an issue here? Okay, is the grammar error-free? So here's the thing. With grammar, it's something we've been taught, it's something that's been drilled. Hopefully by a certain point you can write with correct grammar, but everyone needs to revise their work. That's usually the last step on a paper. Whether you do it or not, that's what your teachers tell you to do. So here's the thing. If you find a source where there are grammar errors, that means that they couldn't be bothered to take the time to revise and edit. And if they couldn't be bothered to take the time to revise and edit, how do we know whether or not they could be bothered to take the time to find correct information? So grammar is a consideration here. That's something to be mindful of in your own writing with your own teachers. Can you be bothered to take the time to check your grammar and check your sources? Something else to look for is if there is an editor. And I will say that especially on the internet, that is very hard to find, and you really can't expect to find it. You're going to have a lot of sources that are reliable where there was no editor, but it is something to look for. If it's there, it's probably a good source. So again, you'll say you'll see if the answer is no to any of the above, the material may be questionable. May be. Again, on all of these, it's not saying that if any one thing is a deal breaker. These are just things you have to consider. Currency, okay, is the information current? Now again, this one may not be relevant to every topic. With literary movements, unless you're doing a movement that is currently happening, people are still writing, and this is still the literary movement we're in, then yeah, currency would be important. If you're doing the Enlightenment, which is long gone, and there's probably not new information about it, then currency is not super important. There's always the possibility with historical topics that new information can be found as, historians find new documents, new letters from people. If you get into like really historic eras, archaeologists and what they find. So it's not that if you're doing a historical topic, currency is never an issue, but it's not always an issue. But setting all those considerations aside, when you are looking for currency, is the information current? So for example, that website from Alternet that we just looked at with George W. Bush, if you were doing a paper on Bush, that website was published, that article was published in 2006. It's not the most current information. You might use information from 2006, but you would probably want to find some current information. What is George Bush doing right now, today, in 2017? Look for page dates. When was the last update? Again, that's not always going to be there, but look for it. Look for copyright dates. How current are the links? If there's something for you to click and it takes you somewhere that no longer exists, those links have expired, they've moved, and that means no one's really taking care of the page. So again, if the answer is yes to any of the above, the material may be questionable. Again, none of these are deal breakers in and of themselves. And then finally, authority. This is one that is always a consideration regardless of what you're talking about. Is the author an expert on the subject? You may not always know that right off the bat, but sometimes their qualifications will be listed. If it says someone's a PhD, they're probably an expert. If they have contact information available on the site, that means they're willing to be contacted. You can contact them and ask questions. That's always a good sign about the author's reliability. Looking at the domain is important. .org, .edu, and .com, no, excuse me, .gov are usually reliable. .com, sometimes, not always, and .net usually is not. Okay, hopefully you've heard that before. If not, you might want to write that down somewhere and remember it. .org, .edu, .gov. Actually, .edu and .gov are usually always good. .org, usually good, not always. .com is iffy, can be not credible, and then .net usually not. Does the publisher or publication have a reputation for reliability? So, for example, if you're doing something current, a person or an event, and you need news sources, think about your news sources. Which ones have a reputation for being biased? Which ones have a reputation for being pretty close to center? Make sure you know that your sources are actual sources. There's a lot of satire websites out there, things that are meant to be untruthful. Think about your topic of study. If you are doing a science fair project, make sure that your sources are known to be reliable in the scientific field. So making sure that the publication is a good publication. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple more sites and talk about whether they would be reliable or not. And again, like I said, these are based on people. You'll have to overlook that, but I do have a few prepared that are related to literary movements. So the first one we have HuffPost. I picked out several sites for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So pretending we're doing a research paper over Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The title, Ruth Bader Ginsburg will defend equality until she simply can't anymore. So think about whether the title is slanted. Okay. When you get on a site, again, I said that the publisher is HuffPost. We have up here Huffington Post. Sometimes you need to research your sources. I've done that before. I've seen a source that I wasn't sure if that was a reliable news source, so I went and Googled the source. So here you might go Google Huffington Post. Is it reliable? And find that out. We do have the author listed. We do have the publication date. We have advertising. I didn't really mention that much, but advertising indicates that the website is needing or trying to make money, which is not always bad, but it's something to consider. Copyright 2017. Let's look at the text. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg will serve the court until her body slows and her mind quits. She said in an interview, so that's not, though it sounds slanted, that's apparently what she said. As long as I can do the work full steam, I will stay on the court. That's a quote. This is very quote heavy. So this could actually probably be used. Huffington Post is not always your best source, but most of it is quotes, so you could use it. However, this would be a better source. .edu. This is law school, so it's an educational site. And of course, this could be used for quotes. This would be where you could get reliable background information. And then you have this. Good old info, please. Random advertising. Can't find a name anywhere. It is, there's a copyright, but there's not a date listed for when this was published. So this would not be a reliable source. This would be your best bet. This is okay as long as you're just quoting the quotes. And this is a no-no. Okay? Now, hopefully we know that Wikipedia is always a no-no as far as using it in your research paper. However, I use Wikipedia all the time when I just have something random that I want to look up and learn something about. So you can use Wikipedia as a jumping off point. Okay, so I have this pulled up because I don't think anyone is doing modernism. And notice that this Wikipedia site is not just literature. It talks about jazz. It talks about the visual arts. It talks about a lot of different things. So you're going to jump to American modernist literature. Okay? And this is going to give you some information so you can kind of get your base of knowledge, not use this as a source you quote in your paper, but use it as a base of knowledge and then find if there's something in here that you can use as a more specific tool or a more specific phrase to Google. Because I'll tell you, if you just Google postmodernism, you're going to have a hard time finding specific information. Okay, this is going to be postmodernism in general, not even necessarily specific to America. Okay, so you do have to learn how to use search terms well. to get the information you need. So I'm going to use this as a jumping off point. American Modernist literature. You read this, go Google American Modernist literature. Okay, Wikipedia comes up again. The second thing here, Norton Anthology of American Literature. I've already pulled it up. Norton is a reliable publisher of literature. In college, my lit books for almost all of my literature classes were Norton. This is some excellent information that you could use. Okay, so you can use Wikipedia as a jumping off point to find some more specific search terms and find a good source of information. So in closing, as you look for sources, keep in mind the criteria you should use to determine if the site is a reliable site for you to use for your research. Again, some things are more relevant to different types of research and different topics, but just keep all of them in your mind as you look at your sources. And then as you start finding your sources, we haven't talked about this very much yet, unless you've already watched the video about works cited. But you will need to maintain a list of information about your sources because you have to give credit to your sources. Now, I've asked you to print sources, and that will be helpful. But sometimes not all the information prints properly, and it definitely doesn't if you just copy and paste it into a Word document. So as you find sources, be sure that somewhere you keep your information written down about the sources. That would include the web address, the title, the author, the date, etc. That's going to be important as we pull together this research project.